Have you ever been judged just by your appearance? Have you ever been looked at as if you didn't belong somewhere, even when that place was yours? That day, I was in the garden of my new home, smelling the fresh grass and feeling proud of a lifetime achievement, until a couple of neighbors spotted me and, without asking a single question, called security. Within minutes, I went from legitimate owner to suspected intruder in my own mansion. What they didn't know was that this moment of humiliation would become the biggest turning point this neighborhood had ever seen, and in the end, it would be they and everyone around them who would be left speechless. This is the story of how a misunderstanding almost took my peace away, but ended up giving me something much greater: respect, and a place I now call home. My name is Ethan Miller, and I'm going to tell you about the most surreal and humiliating day of my life, and also the most satisfying. After 15 years of working day and night building my tech company in Austin, Texas, I had finally managed to buy the mansion of my dreams, a historic property in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, Barton Creek. It was a sunny Saturday morning when I decided to visit the mansion for the first time since signing the real estate papers. I hadn't moved in yet, but I wanted to stroll through the garden, smell the ancient trees, and plan the renovations. I was wearing a simple t-shirt, worn jeans, and an old cap. Exactly how I'd dressed when I still spent my days fixing computers in my small apartment. The house sat atop a hill, surrounded by a manicured lawn and ornate iron fence. I unlocked the side gate with the key my lawyer had given me, walked into the backyard, and gazed at the infinity pool reflecting the blue sky. It was impossible not to smile. I had arrived, or at least I thought I had. As I touched the ancient marble fountain, I heard hurried footsteps and voices coming from the side balcony. An elegant couple, whom I'd never seen before, stared at me as if I were a thief. The woman, blonde, in a designer dress and sunglasses, grabbed the man's arm and pointed at me. I didn't need to hear the exact words to understand they thought I was trespassing. In a matter of seconds, what was supposed to be a moment of peace and conquest turned into the beginning of a scene worthy of a movie, and I had no idea how it would escalate. The man introduced himself as Greg Thompson, the unofficial syndic of the block, and his wife Amber snapped that the neighborhood is tired of strangers spying on their houses. They peppered me with questions that sounded like accusations: who I was, what I was doing there, where I got that key. I took a deep breath and calmly explained that I was the new owner, that the deed had been signed 2 days earlier, and that I was just checking out the garden. Amber gave me a condescending, almost cynical smile and commented that anyone can say that when caught red-handed. In less than 5 minutes, a security guard appeared down the side corridor, impeccably uniformed, radio on his shoulder, and the name Marcus Reed in silver letters on the badge. He asked for my ID. I handed over my driver's license, Texas, and showed the key that opened the side gate. Greg leaned down to Marcus's ear and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I saw the security guard's eyes change. His expression went from professional neutrality to suspicious watchfulness. Marcus asked me to wait while he checked with dispatch and walked away to make a call, leaving a tense silence in the air that made me feel like an intruder in my own backyard. The wind stirred the palm trees, and the surface of the pool trembled, as if the house itself was nervous. Amber lifted her phone and started recording, saying there was a dangerous intruder in the garden, and I was the frozen image in that narrative. I maintained my composure and said we could call my lawyer right then and there, Rachel Dunn, who had all the documents in hand. Greg let out a short laugh at the sound of Miller, as if a guy in worn jeans and a ratty cap couldn't, by definition, own a mansion in Barton Creek. I didn't answer. I just clutched the key in my palm, reminding myself that I'd won bigger battles than that look of disdain. Marcus returned the call with a curt nod, as if unwilling to commit. He said the condominium's central office had no record of my move, and that, per protocol, I should accompany him to the guardhouse. I replied that I wouldn't go anywhere without speaking to my lawyer, Rachel Dunn, yes, Barton Title and Escrow, who had registered the deed at the registry office, Travis County, the previous afternoon. Amber grumbled that fake documents are circulating, and Greg, with that neighborhood sheriff air, suggested, I make it easy to avoid misunderstandings. I held Marcus's gaze and asked for 3 minutes to call on speakerphone. If Rachel agreed, we would proceed together to the main entrance like civilized adults. The phone rang twice. When Rachel answered, I put it on speaker and explained the situation. She took a deep breath. I heard the keyboard clicking on the other end and confirmed Ethan Miller, buyer, deed 2025 ATX 1178, registered at 16/42 of August 12th, effective transfer, keys received from the real estate agency Hillcrest. Realty Marcus cleared his throat. Amber lowered her phone uncomfortably, and Greg still asked for an official email with the PDF of the title recording. Rachel, practical, said she would send it right now to the reception's email, gaytobartoncreekhoa.org, and which would also attach the homeowner's insurance policy. With each confirmed line, I felt the mansion fit back into my chest. Even so, the mood did not give way. Marcus thanked them, but reiterated that the Flowery needed to check the guest list and events, as there was an open house scheduled in the morning with the former broker. I had not known about that visit, a detail that added fuel to the fire of suspicion. I explained that open house had been cancelled when I signed up. Possibly the public calendar hadn't been updated. Greg took advantage of the gap to insinuate that scammers follow luxury home listings. I thought about the boy I was, in Killeen, son of a mechanic, fixing laptops in his bedroom to save money. How many times had I been mistaken for less than I was? I took another breath and changed my strategy. I invited Marcus to join me through the kitchen door, open the cabinets with digital lock, and confirm that only my biometrics, registered when I received the keys, would grant access. Rachel suggested over the phone that we also call Tom Harrington, manager of Hillcrest, to confirm to delivery of keys and to lockbox deactivation from the previous broker. Marcus agreed. If the system I authenticated worked, it would be proof enough to treat me as Sauna Amber crossed her arms, still filming, but now uncertain. Greg glanced at his watch impatiently, as if the reality he preferred was late. I led the way. The house would testify for me. We entered through the side door into the kitchen, and the cool air from the HVAC system enveloped me like a hug I didn't know I needed. The white marble floor reflected the soft light streaming in through the large windows, and there in the center of the kitchen was the island with its built-in digital display. I touched the screen, and it asked for my fingerprint. I placed my finger, and in less than a second, a beep discreetly, he confirmed access. The system unlocked the security drawers and fine china cabinets. Marcus, with the most professional expression possible, tested it himself. Only my fingerprint worked. Amber let out a short sigh, as if waiting for the system to fail so she could have her "I told you so" moment. Greg looked at the floor, visibly uncomfortable, and commented something about beginner's luck. But I continued. I led them to the main room, where the automatic lights turned on upon recognizing my NFC badge, another item provided by the real estate agent. Marcus was taking photos of everything, probably to attach to the condo report. Amber, even with her phone in hand, was no longer filming. Her initial confidence had given way to an awkward silence. In the corner of the room, on a dark wooden table, were the folders containing all the original documents: the deed, the purchase agreement, the insurance policy, and even the cash receipt with the amount and date highlighted. I didn't need to show them, but I wanted to put the doubt to rest. I placed the folders on the kitchen island and let them leaf through them. Marcus turned the pages slowly, checking the stamps and signatures. Greg read the amount and widened his eyes. Amber slammed the folder shut with more force than necessary. Inside, I didn't know whether to laugh or feel angry. There was a quiet pleasure in seeing the truth dismantle prejudice, but also a bitter sadness in realizing how my appearance that day, plain, no expensive brands, no sports car in the garage, had been enough to make me feel like a criminal. Marcus thanked them for their time and patience, promising to update the condominium records immediately. Greg muttered something about "welcome to the neighborhood" that sounded more obligatory than polite. Amber simply said "good morning" before leaving, avoiding eye contact. I stood alone in the kitchen, the entire mansion silent. I touched the cold marble counter and wondered how many more times I would have to prove to strangers that I belonged where I was. But before I could sink into these reflections, an idea began to grow. Perhaps it was time to show in a much more impactful way who I truly was. That night, sitting on the mansion's porch with a strong cup of coffee, I reflected on how the day had begun as a dream and ended as a test of patience. The vision of Greg and Amber judging me without knowing who I was still played out in my mind like a movie I couldn't stop. It was then that I decided I wouldn't let it pass as just another story of veiled prejudice. I would turn that episode into a lesson for everyone there. I took out my cell phone and sent a message to Rachel, my lawyer, asking to get in touch with Tom Harrington, the real estate manager. My idea: host a welcome event at the mansion itself, inviting all the neighbors, including Greg and Amber, to meet me in person. It wouldn't be just any event. I'd bring in musicians from Austin, a renowned chef to prepare a high-end Texas dinner, and open the house so everyone could see for themselves who was living there now. Rachel, ever objective, asked if I wanted to air my dirty laundry in public. I said no. I wanted to show that I had nothing to hide, and that despite the way I'd been treated, I was willing to start my life in that neighborhood on a positive note. Deep down, I also wanted Greg and Amber to feel the weight of seeing me there, the center of attention, not as the suspicious intruder, but as the evening's host. The next day, with the help of an events team, the house began to transform. Fresh flowers in the foyer, fairy lights in the garden, tables set up on the porch overlooking the Barton Creek sunset. Meanwhile, invitations were hand-delivered to each resident of the condominium, with my name prominently displayed. Welcome reception, Miller House. I knew there would be curiosity and behind-the-scenes comments, but that was exactly what I wanted. Everyone in the same place, looking at me without masks and seeing the truth with their own eyes. The morning of the event, I received a notification on my phone. Greg had RSVP'd. Amber had too. I smiled to myself. They had no idea what was in store that night. And for the first time since signing the deed, I felt like that mansion was going to be the stage for something much bigger than just dinner. The sun began to set, tinting the Barton Creek sky with orange and pink hues, and the mansion seemed to glow under the garden lights we'd installed. I was upstairs looking out the window as the first cars arrived. I saw Greg and Amber emerge from a black SUV, dressed as if they were going to a diplomatic reception. She wore an emerald green dress that reflected the lantern light. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit. It was impossible not to notice that they were both more tense than they wanted to show. In the entrance hall, a reception team greeted each guest with a smile and offered a glass of sparkling wine. I stood back for a few minutes, watching from afar as people explored the rooms, admiring the artwork and commenting on the house's architecture. Some glances met mine, curious, trying to connect my image with the name on the invitation. I knew this suspense would work in my favor. At 8 p.m., I asked everyone to gather in the main room. The lights dimmed, and a string quartet began playing a soft rendition of "What a Wonderful World." When the music ended, I walked to the center of the room, under the watchful eye of more than 30 neighbors. I took a deep breath and began, "Good evening. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ethan Miller, and this is my home." I saw the slight arch of Greg and Amber's eyebrows, as if the penny had finally dropped. I continued, briefly telling my story. The boy from Killeen who fixed computers in his bedroom, who founded a tech company at 23, who struggled for a decade to achieve what many said was impossible. I didn't say anything about the incident in the garden. It wasn't the time to expose anyone. But every word carried the subtext everyone there already knew. When I finished, they applauded. Some came to shake my hand. Others thanked me for the invitation. Greg and Amber took a while to approach, but when they finally did, I noticed a smile that mixed embarrassment and recognition. They said, almost simultaneously, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Ethan." After the speech and formal greetings, Greg and Amber approached me again, this time asking to speak privately. I led them to the mansion's study, a room with dark wood paneling, soft lighting, and the scent of old books inherited from the previous owner. I closed the door, and the muffled sounds of the party faded into the distance. Greg was the first to speak, nervously fiddling with the wrist of his watch. He said he wanted to clarify what had happened the day I visited the garden. He admitted his reaction was overblown, and that he'd been driven by his instinct to protect the community. Amber, her gaze fixed on the ground, added that when she saw me there, dressed simply, she didn't imagine I could be the owner. The word hung in the air like a weight. I knew exactly what "didn't imagine" meant. I took a deep breath and said I understood the safety concerns, but that the way I'd been treated exceeded all protocol. I explained that this wasn't the first time this had happened in my life. that growing up in Killeen, coming from a family with no resources, taught me early on that people are quick to judge by what they see. I looked Amber in the eye as I said, I don't hold a grudge. But I hope this story serves as a reminder that appearance and reality don't always go hand in hand. Amber nodded silently. Greg extended his hand and I shook it. There was no magic there, no instant friendship. But there was a mutual recognition, a truce born of awkwardness. Before we returned to the party, I added, "You'll be seeing me around here a lot. I hope that next time we meet without needing security." Greg let out a short laugh, and Amber finally looked me in the eye. We left the office, each carrying our own thoughts. The music was still playing and the night was just beginning. The day after the event, I woke up earlier than usual. The mansion was quiet, and the golden light of dawn streamed through the suite's half-open curtains. I made a strong coffee and went out to the front porch. It was there that I noticed something had changed. Neighbors walking their dogs waved at me. Some even slowed down to ask how I was adjusting to the neighborhood. This was unusual. For the first week, hardly anyone spoke to me. When I opened my phone, I saw messages I hadn't expected. Residents who hadn't shown up at reception were sending me greetings, some apologizing for not being there. In the condominium's closed group Facebook, there were photos of the event taken by the neighbors themselves, the bright living room, the string quartet, the outdoor dinner. Comments praised the generosity of the new resident and the memorable evening I had provided. Among the messages was a post from Greg publicly thanking me for the invitation and saying he was happy to have Ethan Miller as part of our community. Amber also commented on the post, something short but symbolic. The night was perfect. Welcome, Ethan. It wasn't a confession about what had happened before, but to those familiar with the story, it sounded like a veiled apology. That began to change the narrative. I was no longer the suspicious intruder I'd been a few days earlier. Now I was the neighbor who'd thrown the most elegant party of the year. As satisfying as it was, I knew this change in image wasn't just due to my gesture of opening my home. It also stemmed from the fact that one way or another, everyone had heard what happened the day I was mistaken for an intruder. The story was already circulating through the hallways, in conversations at the golf club, around the tables at the local cafe, and curiously, no one was sharing it with anger. On the contrary, the situation had become an example, a living reminder of how hasty judgments can embarrass us. And me? I just observed, without correcting details, letting each person form their own version. Sometimes the best way to teach is to let people confront what they did. 2 days later, on a rainy morning, I decided to go out and work on my laptop at a cafe just a few minutes from the mansion. Blue Bonnet Coffee House. It was a cozy place, smelling of freshly ground coffee and freshly baked pecan cake, frequented by long-time residents and young entrepreneurs. I chose a table by the window, ordered a cappuccino, and began reviewing some contracts. When I looked up, I saw Amber coming through the door, holding a red umbrella still dripping with water. She saw me almost immediately and hesitated for a second as if deciding whether to approach me or not. Eventually, she approached, a little shyly, and asked if she could sit. I nodded, and she set her bag on the chair next to me, resting her hands on the cup of tea the barista brought her shortly after. Amber took a deep breath and said she wanted to personally thank me for the party invitation and apologize. Her voice shook slightly, but it was sincere. He said he grew up in a very different neighborhood, where people had an automatic way of protecting themselves from anything outside of what they considered familiar. He said he wasn't making excuses, but that day he'd reacted without thinking, and that he'd been feeling bad about it ever since. I listened to her in silence, taking small sips of coffee. When she finished, she simply said she understood, but I added that situations like that leave scars, even when they're resolved. She nodded, looking out the window, and commented that this conversation would make her rethink her own actions from then on. It was hard to say if it would change anything in the long run, but at least there was an acknowledgement. Before she left, Amber left a card with her personal number on the table and said if I needed anything in the neighborhood, I could call her. I stared at the card for a few seconds after she left, listening to the sound of rain against the glass. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a step in the right direction. In the days following the meeting with Amber at Blue Bonnet Coffee House, I began to notice subtle changes in the way people treated me. At the golf club, where I'd previously gone almost unnoticed, Now some locals would come up to me and chat, asking about my business or commenting on the party. At the local market, the cashier recognized me and said he'd heard that the new neighbor in Barton Creek is a respectable guy. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of a story circulating behind the scenes, now with a more fair twist. Amber seemed to have become a sort of unofficial spokesperson for my defense. I learned from Rachel that she had told other women in the neighborhood about our conversation at the cafe, admitting that she had misjudged me and that she had learned a lesson. Interestingly, by owning up to her mistake, she began to inspire others to reevaluate their own prejudices. Greg, for example, still maintained his proud demeanor, but he no longer avoided me. In fact, he even invited me to a barbecue at his house that weekend. I accepted the invitation, not out of a need for friendship, but because I knew that each new encounter helped reinforce my presence there as something natural. The invisible barrier that separated the new owner of the mansion from the rest of the neighborhood was dissolving. And deep down, there was a certain pleasure in seeing that the transformation came not from fiery speeches or direct confrontations, but from small interactions, casual conversations, and gestures of good faith. This change in climate also impacted my daily routine. I started receiving invitations to community events and HOA meetings, things I probably would have been excluded from weeks before. Little by little, the mansion stopped being seen as the intruder's house and became Ethan Miller's house. It was subtle, but crucial. And even without telling anyone, I knew I still had an ace up my sleeve, something that would definitively show I was there to stay and to contribute. But I'd save that for the right moment. Since the day of the party, I'd been working on a quiet project, something I hadn't even mentioned to Rachel. It was an idea that came to me after learning more about Barton Creek and realizing that behind all the elegance and comfort, there were also invisible people, gardeners, cleaners, delivery drivers, security guards, people who kept the neighborhood going but were rarely recognized. I contacted the management of Barton Creek Community Center and proposed funding the complete renovation of one of the oldest areas, the multi-purpose room, which had peeling paint, broken furniture, and poor lighting. The condition was simple. The space would be reopened for free use not only by residents, but also by all employees and their families. I wanted it to be a meeting place, where social barriers would disappear. As the renovations progressed, I kept the matter a secret. I would go to the site at night to supervise the work and watch the hall transform. Repainted walls, new flooring, a kitchen equipped for events, modern lighting, and a small stage for performances. I knew that when the time came to reveal the details, the surprise would carry a special weight. On the day of the reopening, the HOA held a general meeting in the hall itself. When everyone arrived, the place was already immaculate, with fresh flowers and a large illuminated sign, "Welcome to the new Barton Creek Hall, a space for everyone." Greg, Amber, and several other neighbors were present, curious. So I took the microphone and explained that this project had been funded entirely by me, as a welcome gift to the community. But I emphasized, this isn't just my home, it's our neighborhood, and everyone, without exception, deserves a place to feel like they belong. The silence that followed was broken by heartfelt applause, and I realized that, in that moment, my position on Barton Creek had changed forever. The reopening of the Barton Creek Hall became the talk of the town not only in the neighborhood, but throughout the city of Austin. The next day, Austin Chronicle published an article with the title, "New Barton Creek Resident Funds Community Renovation." The report featured photos of the hall before and after the renovation, as well as an excerpt from my opening night speech. Soon, other local Facebook and Instagram pages began sharing the news. The impact on the neighborhood was immediate. At the golf club, a gentleman I'd never met offered me a coffee and told me he'd lived there for over 20 years, saying he couldn't remember another resident doing something so meaningful for everyone. Condominium staff began greeting me with genuine respect, some even saying they now felt like a true part of Barton Creek. The gesture, which had seemed natural to me, was revolutionary to them. Greg, who had maintained a certain distance until then, came up to me at the market and said, "Ethan, you've accomplished something I've never seen happen here. It's not easy to break through the invisible walls of this place, but you did." Amber, for her part, went even further. She began actively participating in community meetings and even suggested new integration projects, always mentioning that my initiative had inspired the change. It was as if people were suddenly competing to see who could contribute the most to the neighborhood, a healthy competition that benefited everyone. I realized my presence there was no longer questioned. On the contrary, my voice now carried weight in the HOA's decisions, and ironically, it had all started with a misunderstanding that nearly threw me out of my own backyard. Life has a curious way of turning insults into opportunities. A few weeks after the reopening, on a quiet evening, I sat alone on the back porch, gazing at the pool reflecting the starry Texas sky. The air smelled fresh of wet grass, and everything was silent except for the distant sound of an insistent cricket. It was there, amidst that stillness, that I realized the extent of the transformation that had occurred, not only in the neighborhood, but in myself. I remembered the day I first stepped into the mansion's garden, feeling pride and peace, and how within minutes that moment was shattered by Greg and Amber's distrust and hostility. At that moment I could have reacted angrily. I could have created an open confrontation, but I chose another path, and it was that choice that shaped everything that came after. I also thought about the years of struggle before I got there. The late nights in my small apartment in Killeen, coding until my eyes burned. The overdue bills, the clients who doubted me because of my age or appearance, the friends who gave up along the way. Every step of that journey had prepared me to handle that situation differently than most would expect. Now, sitting on that porch, I realized that the mansion wasn't just a symbol of financial success. It had become the setting for a life lesson in patience, empathy, and strategy. I had gained more than just a house. I had gained respect, something no amount of money can buy. And perhaps most importantly, I discovered that in any place, no matter how closed it may seem, there is always room to create bridges where before there were only walls. The following weekend, during an informal dinner with some neighbors at Barton Creek Hall, someone asked me what I'd learned most since moving there. I thought for a few seconds before answering, because I knew it wasn't just a casual question. It was an opportunity to summarize the entire journey. He said the biggest lesson was understanding that behind every rash action lies a story we don't know. Sometimes that story is full of fears, unconscious biases, or past experiences that shape how people react. But he also said that none of this justifies treating someone with disrespect. True change begins when we choose to respond with patience rather than aggression, even when we have every reason to do otherwise. I looked at Greg, who was sitting a few feet away, and at Amber, who was smiling slightly. I continued by saying that if that day in the garden had ended in a fight, I would probably still be the intruder to half the neighborhood. But because I chose to act differently, the narrative completely changed, and more than that, the community changed as well. I finished by saying, in the end, the respect you earn doesn't come from what you have, but from how you behave when put to the test. The silence that followed was the kind that speaks louder than applause. Some nodded, others smiled, and I felt that message echo for a long time in each of them. A few days after that dinner, on a golden autumn afternoon, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. Dry leaves were falling from the trees, covering the ground in shades of orange and brown, and there was a faint scent of burning wood in the air, a sign that the fireplaces were beginning to be used again. I passed several houses and was greeted by almost everyone I met. They weren't just formal nods. There was warmth and sincerity in the smiles. When I reached the gate of my mansion, I stood for a moment, simply observing it. The late afternoon light reflected in the windows, and I realized that this place, which at first seemed merely a reward for my work, had become a symbol of something much greater. I remembered the bitter feeling of that first day, surrounded by suspicious glances, and compared it with the present, a home embedded in a community that now saw me as part of it. Greg drove by slowly and waved with a genuine smile. A few steps behind, Amber was walking with her puppy, and she smiled too, saying a simple good afternoon that carried much more than 2 words. It was silent proof that everything had changed. Before entering, I looked out at the horizon once more and thought about how many stories like mine happen every day. Stories where snap judgments could create walls, but end up becoming bridges. I smiled to myself, knowing that if someone ever asked me how I earned respect in a place where no one knew me, I would have a simple answer, with patience, firmness, and the certainty that time always reveals the truth. I closed the gate behind me, and the mansion fell silent, ready to hold more chapters of my life. If I've learned anything from this story, it's that life doesn't always test us with big battles. Sometimes it's the small moments that reveal who we truly are. I could have reacted with anger. I could have turned that misunderstanding into a conflict with no way out. But I chose another path, and it was that choice that changed everything. Today, every greeting I receive, every smile I see as I walk through the neighborhood, reminds me that respect isn't bought. It's earned day after day through action and patience. And as difficult as it may be, sometimes we need to be the bridge connecting two worlds that would never have met on their own. If this story touched you, please like it, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a situation where you had to prove you deserved to be where you were? Your answer may inspire others, and who knows, maybe it will be the next story told here.